She had more money than most people would ever see in a lifetime, and she died over a rent dispute. That sentence alone should make you pause. Because when you hear $12 million trust fund, you imagine safety. You imagine lawyers on speed dial, powerful friends, a name that opens doors and closes problems before they even begin. You imagine a woman who is untouchable. But that illusion is exactly what killed Nancy Pfister. I want you to picture this: a woman who dined with presidents, who partied with Hunter S. Thompson, who once turned down a marriage proposal from Michael Douglas, who grew up in a world where Aspen wasn't a ski town yet, but a playground being built by her own family. Nancy Pfister didn't just live in Aspen. Her family helped create it. Her father co-founded the Buttermilk Ski Area and transformed a dying mining town into one of the most exclusive destinations on Earth. At her peak, you didn't ask, "Who owns Aspen?" You asked, "Do you know Nancy Pfister?" Everyone did. And that was the problem. Because when everyone knows your name, they also think they know who you are. They think your wealth makes you arrogant, that your privilege makes you careless, that your money makes you immune to consequences. But here's the secret no one talks about. Nancy Pfister wasn't killed by greed. She wasn't killed by jealousy. She wasn't killed by some grand criminal mastermind. She was killed because she trusted the wrong people with the keys to her house. In today's story, I want to take you behind the polished surface of old money, behind the ski resorts, the champagne, the famous last name, because this isn't just a murder story. This is a story about how being rich can make you visible and how being visible can make you vulnerable. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why $12 million couldn't save her. Let me take you back to Aspen, Colorado, before it became a brand, before it became a backdrop for luxury magazines and Instagram fantasies, back when Aspen was still rough around the edges, when the mountains felt wild and unsupervised, and the people who arrived there believed they were pioneers of a new kind of American paradise. This was the world Nancy Pfister was born into. Aspen wasn't just her hometown, it was her inheritance. Her father wasn't a passive investor or a distant millionaire. He was one of the men who helped build the town's future with his own hands and his own vision, co-founding the Buttermilk Ski Area and transforming Aspen from a forgotten mining settlement into a magnet for wealth, fame, and power. When the snow fell, money followed, and when money followed, influence arrived, and Nancy grew up right at the center of it. By the time she reached adulthood, she didn't need to introduce herself. Her last name did the work for her. In Aspen's tight social circle, being a Pfister meant you were part of the town's DNA. You weren't a visitor, you weren't a guest, you were legacy. She inherited a trust fund estimated at around $12 million, not flashy billionaire money, but old money, quiet money, the kind that sits in the background and whispers instead of shouting, enough to live comfortably for multiple lifetimes, enough to never worry about rent, arguments, or small disputes, and yet, ironically, it was rent that would end her life. Nancy's lifestyle reflected the contradictions of old money. She wasn't obsessed with showing off. She wasn't chasing attention. She was known for being social, charismatic, sometimes difficult, sometimes generous, often blunt. People described her as complicated, warm one moment, abrasive the next, someone who could host legendary dinners and then disappear for weeks. She moved easily among celebrities and politicians, but she was never impressed by them. Fame didn't intimidate her because she'd grown up surrounded by it. She had relationships, flirtations, near marriages, but she never fully settled into a conventional role. No husband, no children, no carefully curated image. Aspen knew her as a fixture, someone who belonged there as much as the mountains themselves. But here's where the theme of this story quietly begins to take shape. When you live in a place where everyone knows you, boundaries blur. Familiarity replaces caution. Power dynamics get distorted. People stop seeing danger because danger doesn't look dangerous anymore. It looks like neighbors, like friends, like tenants. Nancy owned a house in Aspen that she decided to rent out. On paper, this was nothing. A minor financial decision for a woman of her wealth, a casual agreement, a handshake-level arrangement compared to the deals happening around her every day. But this wasn't just a rental. This was an invitation into her private space. And when things started to go wrong, when the rent dispute escalated, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an annoyance, something that would be resolved the way everything else in her life always had been, through conversation, through pressure, through the quiet authority of her name. That assumption would cost her everything. Because this story isn't about Aspen's glamour. It's about what happens when old money meets entitlement, resentment, and access. It's about how the illusion of safety can be more dangerous than poverty because it convinces you that nothing truly bad can happen to you. And as we move forward, I want you to keep one thought in your mind. The people who killed Nancy Pfister didn't break into her world. They were already inside it. For most of her life, nothing truly threatened Nancy Pfister. Problems came and went the way they always do when money cushions the fall. Arguments ended with drinks. Conflicts dissolved after a few phone calls. In Aspen, reputation mattered. And Nancy's reputation was deeply embedded in the town's history. She was difficult, yes, stubborn, absolutely, but she was also untouchable. Or at least that's what everyone believed, including Nancy herself. She trusted familiarity more than fear. She trusted the past more than instinct. And that trust shaped one decision that seemed insignificant at the time. She rented her house, not because she needed the money. The rent was irrelevant compared to her trust fund. This was convenience, not necessity. She allowed a couple to live in her home while she stayed elsewhere, assuming it would be temporary, manageable, uncomplicated. It wasn't. The tenants fell behind on rent, excuses piled up, deadlines passed, conversations turned tense. What should have been a routine landlord issue began to carry emotional weight, because in Nancy's world, money disputes weren't about survival, they were about respect, and she felt disrespected. She pushed back, she demanded payment, she made it clear that she was done being patient. To her, this was asserting boundaries. To them, it felt like pressure, humiliation, exposure. They weren't arguing with a landlord, they were confronting Aspen royalty, and that imbalance mattered more than anyone realized. As the dispute escalated, resentment grew quietly, not explosive, not dramatic, just simmering, the kind that feeds on perceived injustice, on the idea that someone else has everything while you're fighting to keep a roof over your head. Nancy didn't see danger. She saw stubbornness. She believed authority would prevail as it always had. She underestimated how desperation can twist logic, how shame can turn into rage, how proximity can breed obsession. Then came the decision that sealed her fate. She returned to the house. She didn't bring security. She didn't bring friends. She didn't alert anyone that she was staying there. Why would she? It was her home. Her name was on everything. The idea that she could be in danger inside her own property didn't even cross her mind. This is the moment where the story tilts. Because while Nancy believed the conflict was still negotiable, the people on the other side had crossed a psychological line. What had begun as a rent dispute had transformed into something darker, something personal. They didn't see a wealthy woman asserting her rights. They saw an obstacle standing between them and survival, between them and control. What happened next wasn't impulsive. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a sudden outburst of violence. It was a decision. Nancy was murdered inside her own home. The details are disturbing, not because of how brutal they were, but because of how unnecessary it all was. $12 million, decades of legacy, a life filled with access and opportunity, ended over an amount of money she wouldn't have noticed missing. When the news broke, Aspen froze. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not to someone like her. Murders belonged to other places, other lives, other social classes. This shattered the illusion that wealth created immunity. And as investigators peeled back the layers, the story became even more unsettling. The killers weren't strangers. They weren't faceless criminals lurking in the dark. They were people she knew, people she had allowed into her space, people who had learned her routines, her habits, her sense of safety. The rise and fall of Nancy Pfister wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no sudden scandal, no public disgrace, no slow descent into chaos. There was just one miscalculation, believing that money could replace caution. And in the aftermath, Aspen was left asking a question it had never seriously considered before. If someone like Nancy Pfister could be killed so easily, what did safety even mean anymore? When the investigation began, the town wanted a clean story, a simple explanation, a random act of violence that could be neatly folded away so Aspen could return to sleep. But the truth refused to stay quiet. Because the deeper authorities looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't chaos. It was familiarity turned lethal. Nancy's body was found inside the very house she believed she still controlled. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no dramatic break-in, the kind of scene that tells you immediately what went wrong before anyone even speaks it out loud. She had let them in. What followed felt less like a police case and more like a slow unraveling of assumptions. The people responsible weren't hiding in the shadows of the town. They were already known, already connected to her daily life, already aware of her movements, her habits, her trust. The rent dispute was no longer a side detail. It became the spine of the story. Investigators learned that the conflict had grown increasingly bitter, conversations had turned cold, tensions had hardened into something personal. For Nancy, it was about principle, about refusing to be taken advantage of, about drawing a line and expecting it to be respected. For the others, it was something else entirely. It was humiliation, fear, the pressure of being exposed, the realization that they were about to lose not just a place to live, but the illusion that they still had control over their lives. And when control disappears, people don't always act rationally. The murder itself wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was disturbingly intimate. The kind of violence that happens when emotions have been building quietly for too long, when resentment has time to mature, when anger stops shouting and starts calculating. What shocked the public wasn't just that Nancy had been killed, it was how ordinary the motive was. Not revenge, not greed, not a grand inheritance plot, just rent, just a dispute that could have been resolved with a check, a lawyer, or time. Instead, it ended with a life erased and multiple lives destroyed. When arrests were made, Aspen's reaction was visceral. This wasn't an outsider crime. This wasn't something the town could blame on poverty or distance or unfamiliar faces. This was internal, homegrown, a fracture inside its own myth. Media coverage swarmed the case, but there was an awkward hesitation in the tone. Reporters struggled to reconcile the image of an untouchable socialite with the reality of her vulnerability. Headlines whispered what people were afraid to say out loud. If old money couldn't protect her, what did it really protect? People began revisiting memories, replaying conversations, questioning moments that once seemed harmless. Some remembered Nancy as generous, others as sharp-tongued. Some admired her independence, others resented her authority. In death, she became a mirror, reflecting everyone's unresolved feelings about privilege, entitlement, and power. And maybe the most unsettling detail of all was this. Nancy didn't die because she was careless. She died because she believed the rules of her world still applied. She believed reputation mattered. She believed ownership meant authority. She believed familiarity equaled safety. Those beliefs had carried her through decades of life without serious consequence until the day they didn't. And when the truth finally settled, when the case was no longer speculation but fact, Aspen was forced to accept something deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just a murder. It was the collapse of an illusion. When I look at Nancy Pfister's story, I don't see a careless woman or a foolish mistake. I see something far more unsettling. A system of belief that quietly teaches wealthy people the wrong lessons about safety. Because from the outside, Nancy had everything society tells us equals protection, money, legacy, social power, a name that carried weight in every room she entered. And yet none of that mattered when the danger came from inside the circle she trusted. This is where I want to be very clear with you. Nancy Pfister wasn't arrogant for thinking she was safe. She was conditioned to believe it. When you grow up in a world where problems dissolve because of who you are, you stop recognizing risk as something personal, threats feel theoretical, consequences feel negotiable. Old money doesn't teach you how to survive danger. It teaches you how to assume danger will never arrive. That's the uncomfortable truth behind this case. We love stories about wealth as armor, gated homes, security systems, powerful connections, but none of those protect you from resentment that has time to grow in close proximity. None of them protect you from people who know your routines, your habits, your blind spots. Nancy's killers didn't defeat her strength. They exploited her assumptions. And this is where public opinion often becomes cruel. After tragedies like this, people ask the wrong questions. Why didn't she just evict them sooner? Why didn't she call the police? Why didn't she bring security? Those questions assume hindsight is wisdom. But in real life, danger rarely announces itself as danger. It arrives disguised as inconvenience, as annoyance, as a dispute you believe you've handled before. Nancy didn't feel threatened, she felt irritated, and that distinction matters. Her story also exposes something else we rarely discuss: the resentment wealth can quietly create, not the loud, obvious envy, but the slow burning kind, the kind that forms when someone feels small next to your power, invisible next to your name, replaceable next to your resources. In those conditions, a simple disagreement stops being about money and starts being about dignity. And when dignity feels attacked, people can justify the unthinkable. This channel doesn't exist to glorify tragedy. It exists to examine the cracks beneath the surface, to question the myths we're taught to admire. Nancy Pfister's life forces us to confront one of the hardest truths about privilege. Wealth can isolate you, familiarity can deceive you, and safety is never guaranteed, no matter how high the price tag. I want to know what you think. Do you see this as a tragic accident of trust, or as an inevitable consequence of a system that teaches people they are untouchable? Was this preventable, or was it simply the moment when illusion finally met reality? Your perspective matters, because stories like this don't end when the case is closed. They continue in the questions we ask and the lessons we choose to ignore. Nancy Pfister didn't disappear in a blaze of scandal or a long public downfall. She vanished the way many people with quiet power do, suddenly, privately, and in a way that leaves more questions than answers. There was no final interview, no public confession, no moment where she got to explain herself. One day, she was a permanent fixture of Aspen. The next, she became a headline people whispered about with disbelief. And then, slowly, she became a memory the town didn't quite know how to hold. Aspen moved on the way wealthy places always do. The ski seasons returned, the tourists came back, new names replaced old ones, but something had shifted beneath the surface. A subtle awareness that money doesn't erase danger, it just changes its shape. Nancy's legacy isn't found in buildings or trust funds or family names carved into history. It lives in the silence that followed her death, in the uncomfortable realization that privilege can dull instinct, that familiarity can be fatal, that the most dangerous threats don't always come from strangers in the dark, but from people standing inside your life, smiling, waiting. Her story leaves us with no neat moral, no satisfying resolution, just a haunting aftertaste. $12 million couldn't buy her another morning. A famous name couldn't unlock a second chance. A lifetime of access couldn't protect her from one ordinary conflict taken too far. Some stories were never meant to be known. They stayed buried under reputation, under wealth, under the illusion of safety. But this one surfaced anyway, forcing us to look directly at something we'd rather ignore: that safety is never guaranteed, that power doesn't equal control, and that even the most protected lives can end in the most unprotected moments. Now you know her story. And once you know it, it's hard to believe in the myth of invulnerability ever again.